Guten Abend, wir
Good evening. We are about to start.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, in here, but also in the live stream, I'm Lena Luik of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and I'm happy to welcome you tonight. This is going to be a panel discussion about food systems in crisis, overcoming neo-colonial dependencies. The event is being held in cooperation with Bread for the World and TMG Research. Now, ever since the outbreak of the corona pandemic, global food systems have been in crisis. The war of aggression on Ukraine and the resulting price crisis have dramatically exacerbated the situation. Last year, policymakers tried to find answers to these questions. And on the one hand, they started to activate existing bodies and mechanisms and programs, but they also undertook new initiatives like the UN Crisis Response Group or the Global Alliance for Food Security of the G7, and we will definitely talk about the latter tonight. Tonight's event will focus on how policy responses to the food crisis can address structural causes, reduce neo-colonial dependencies, and place particularly affected, marginalized groups at the center of the debate. And I'm very happy to introduce a video statement now by Professor Michael Fakhri, who is the UN Special Rapporteur for Food Security. He will only be here tomorrow, so he will be with us tonight via the live screen, and he has sent us a video statement.
Hello, my name is Michael Fakhri, and I am the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. This means I am the leading independent expert on the right to food for the entire UN system. I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel. I was unable to make it to Berlin in time to appear live, but due to the power of German civil society and the generosity of the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture, I will be attending the Global Forum for Food and Agriculture this week. I will be speaking at the opening event and will be actively participating throughout the week. If you see me, please do come up and say hello. As we all know, when the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020, there was almost immediately a food crisis. Of course, we are still in the pandemic and we are still in a food crisis. But to be sure, even if the pandemic ended tomorrow, even if the war in Ukraine ended tomorrow, we would still be in a food crisis. In my reports to the UN General Assembly, I've outlined in detail what the root causes are of the food crisis and what can be done. In my newest report to the Human Rights Council on violence in food systems, I explain how food systems rely on extractive economies and relationships of dependency. That report should be coming out any week now. The questions presented on this panel today are exactly the right questions, and the lineup of speakers looks fantastic. So I will leave it to them to more directly answer those questions posed to the panel. With those questions in mind, I will present my perspective on how the food crisis has unfolded and what can be done on an international level. In my position as UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, I speak to governments, civil society, and businesses from all over the world. I am an active member of the UN Committee on World Food Security, and I was on the integrating team of the Food Systems Summit. So in a way, during this food crisis, I've been one center point for global conversations. I not only bring a human rights perspective, but I also bring a perspective from the global south, since my country, Lebanon, has been one of the hardest hit places in this food crisis. The challenge at the outset of the food crisis was that we all immediately felt the implications of the fact that all our food systems are interconnected. Whether it was because of closing borders to workers or blocking exports, whether it was supply chain disruption caused by sick workers or war, or if it was supporting local producers, every single national decision to address the food crisis had global impact. And yet, countries were not able to come together to develop a coordinated global plan of action to tackle the food crisis. The world's governments had multiple opportunities. The 2021 UN Food Systems Summit brought the world together to address food systems transformation. But unfortunately, the food crisis was not on the agenda. Nor did the summit leave us with any guidance or mechanisms on how countries should cooperate. There were attempts in 2020 and 2021 to use the UN Committee on World Food Security, also known as the CFS, so to use the CFS and its powers of coordination. Some very powerful countries and export-oriented countries blocked that initiative at the CFS. Countries in the global south know that the only way to realistically tackle the food crisis is to cooperate and coordinate through multilateralism and human rights. Powerful countries thought that they could go at this alone by exercising bilateral or regional power to deal with a global problem. Sometimes power blinds people from reality. We have no choice but to work together. We have no choice but to use multilateralism and human rights to cooperate and coordinate. Despite these early setbacks at the costs of millions of people's health and life, I think the struggle to develop an international plan to cooperate and coordinate is still in play. There is still some hope at the CFS, and I think the coming year at the CFS will be crucial. So I encourage all governments and civil society from the global south to be as active as possible at the CFS. But also, over this past year, I've seen an increased recognition of the right to food. When the pandemic started, many forces tried to block or marginalize the right to food in international policy spaces. However, in the past year, I have seen an interest in and recognition of the right to food in forums such as the Security Council, the G7, and the UN Conference on Trade and Development, also known as UNCTAD. The UN General Assembly was very positive about my report on the pandemic and food crisis, and they have directed me to provide them an outline of what recovery could look like from a right to food perspective. I hope everyone here today joins me and the scores of countries and millions of people pushing for an international commitment to the right to food as the way forward. A commitment to the right to food is by definition a commitment to international cooperation and coordination. We should all be pushing for a global action plan for the right to food. My presence here this week builds upon the momentum around recognizing the right to food. I will be spending my time encouraging governments to include a commitment to the right to food in the final communiqué. A commitment to the right to food would be a significant advancement for everyone fighting on the front lines in this food crisis, for everyone pushing for a global action plan for the right to food. Thank you very much, and I hope to see many of you in person this week.
Vielen Dank an Herrn.
Thank you, Mr. Fakhri, for these insisting words and the appeal, his call for more international cooperation and for the combat for the right to food. I guess in our discussion later, we can come back to the aspect that even if the Ukraine war ended tomorrow, we'd still have a food crisis, which is what Mr. Fakhri underlined. I would like to give the floor now to Ophelia Nick. She's the Parliamentary State Secretary at the Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture and has been a member of Parliament for the Green Party since 2021. And in the ministry, she is in charge of international issues, and she will give us an idea of the international strategy, the new strategy of the BMEL. A lot has happened since the term of office and since her term of office, and we are looking forward to her input. Right. Thank you, Mrs. Luig. And I was really impressed by what Mr. Michael Fakhri has just told us. And I am really looking forward to meeting 90 delegations at the ministry, because then we will have an excellent opportunity to talk, which is what we will do in Berlin as of the day after tomorrow. Now, tonight's event is very important because food security worldwide is an important topic, and we still have to do a lot in order to make sure that everybody in this world enjoys this right. And we are far from achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 2 of the 2030 Agenda. The contrary is actually true. The number of people suffering from hunger has even been rising for several years, and because of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, we are dealing once again with a major deterioration of the situation of the anyway precarious food situation in many countries of the world. Now, Putin had hunger in mind from day one on. He used purposefully hunger as a weapon to destabilize Ukraine and also to divide the world community. And the narratives that Russia is trying to send are perfidious communication of lies. It's not the sanctions against Russia that are responsible for worsening the hunger crisis, but solely the country that started the war. Putin did not create the problem of hunger through his war, but he is deliberately playing on the volatility of our food systems. And it is this volatility that needs to be addressed, turned off, and we need to implement a sustainable, resilient food production globally. The consequences of the climate crisis, droughts, floods, are making themselves increasingly felt, especially in the countries of the global south. And also the loss of biodiversity and of fertile, healthy soils is contributing to the fact that food production is no longer secure in many countries of the world. And the corona pandemic has also shown that the supply chains tend to collapse. And then there are still wars and violent conflicts in many parts of the world, which means people go hungry, which is what we right now see in Yemen or in Afghanistan. For example, the Russian war of aggression has also exposed one-sided dependencies and caused prices for inputs such as fertilizer and fuel to rise and food to become more expensive. which is what everybody suffers from as well. Now, precisely because of this multiple crisis situation that we are dealing with, we need to adhere to the goal of implementing the right to food and the Agenda 2030 globally. This is also part of the coalition agreement of the German government. By the way, in doing so, it is particularly important to us to reconcile global food security, climate protection, and the conservation and protection of biodiversity. To achieve this, we need a smart and sustainable mix of short-term measures to alleviate the greatest need as quickly as possible, and we need medium and long-term measures to structurally improve the global food situation. And then we also need to deal with the international agricultural markets, which need to be kept open or need to be opened. And we need a fundamental change, a transformation of the agricultural and food systems to secure access to adequate food for the world's population without further exacerbating other crises. What is needed is sustainable, resource-conserving agriculture that protects and preserves the foundations for food production in the future, and the transition towards a sustainable agricultural and food system contains a major number of building blocks. Now, important buzzwords for Germany would be the expansion of the ecological or agroecological agriculture, the restructuring of agricultural animal husbandry, promoting a more sustainable way of eating, empowering young people and women to actively shape agriculture and rural areas as equal players. I mean, you tend to think that the situation here is much better than elsewhere, but if you look at access to land, you see that there are a number of problems here too. The transformation to sustainable farming and food systems would also be driven in the countries of the global south. The UNFSS 2021 has made this clear and was the first step to develop global solutions, like, for example, the national pathways. Sustainable and future-oriented strategies and concepts are part of the national pathways, also here in Germany. After all, small farmers are already making a decisive contribution to food security, and food security needs to be strengthened locally. Also, by means of the use of new and traditional varieties and production methods adapted to the climate and to the specific location. And the goal must be to reduce one-sided dependence on food imports and the diversification of trade relations and more food sovereignty. Now, we need cooperation, ladies and gentlemen. Cooperation is the key to success. International cooperation, but also cooperation between governmental and non-governmental players, politics, science, business, and the civil society. In June 2022, together with the Federal Foreign Office and the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, we held a major conference on international food security for this very reason. And there we talked about global food security with a focus on the impact of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, a priority topic at our G7 Agricultural Ministers Conference in Stuttgart last May as well. When we also talk about the transformation of food systems at the Global Forum for Food and Agriculture, GFFA, and as I said, 90 delegations will be here in Berlin in order to talk about these very topics in order to talk about small farming or small-scale farming, or the particular role of women and the importance for this process of transformation. All players need to be at one table to decide on the common future and the best possible governance. And therefore, we advocate for participatory processes and bodies in our responsibility, especially for a strengthening of the CFS World Food Committee and the use of our cooperation with the FAO for sustainable transformation of all farming and food systems. And of course, we are in touch with all CFS agencies. And of course, I would like to also underline our active maintenance of the communication with everyone in the CFS, and in particular the CSIPM. We're also making an important contribution to this transformation process through our application-oriented funding instruments in the area of research and innovation. Now, it's clear that global food security is a major challenge that we can only meet together, and it has to be a top priority on the agenda on all levels. And it must also lead to solutions that finally realize the right to adequate, and that means sufficient and healthy food for all people, while at the same time dealing with the enormous global crises. Thank you.
Ja, herzlichen
Thank you very much, Ms. Nick, for this interesting insight into the work of your ministry. And as far as the contents of your speech are concerned, we are definitely going to come back to that in the course of our discussion. But before we do so, we'd like to announce another video. The following video will be shown in order to illustrate the repercussions of the global food crisis on marginalized communities. And we'd like to use this opportunity to also give a voice to those people in the global south that are most affected. And of course, it's all in the title of our event tonight. This video was produced by TMG in the framework of their Urban Food Futures program. And it shows the work of FACT, a community-based organization. They work in the socially deprived areas of Cape Town, and they work on structural inequality and food security. And they also deal with the stigmatization or destigmatization of hunger. And I think we are going to hear some very interesting voices and, well, enjoy this video.
If I was to ask you what hunger looks like in your areas, places you live, what would you say?
It looks like me. It doesn't really have a face. You can't tell who's hungry and who isn't, because I think the large majority is hungry. Yeah, everyone is hungry. So there isn't really a specific face that you can pin to hunger.
So the right to food looks like having space and the agency to grow your own food. The right to food looks like having the autonomy to choose what you buy and what you eat every day. The right to food is having a wholesome, nutritious meal to eat every day for families, all households, and it's difficult to imagine in the state that we're living and the reality of things.
Mentally, I think that creates a ton of strain that that no one really talks about. No one really talks about being hungry and not having enough food. And I think that's a feeling that people feel quite often, that there isn't enough food. I haven't, like, there's times when I've thought, okay, what am I going to eat today? And my solution to not thinking about that is to stay constantly busy, to constantly be up to something. But then there comes a time when I can't even motivate myself to go beyond that. Yeah, I think psychologically it stagnates an entire population, and we just constantly stay in survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, you can't think beyond today, you can't think beyond the next 12 hours. Yeah, it's sort of like, yeah, it's hand to mouth.
What was around me. A lot of people lost their jobs, they lost their incomes, and then they found themselves faced with a whole lot. When I'm saying a whole lot is you would find that in a typical household, a father would get up and go to work. Maybe there are 2 or 3 children that would be at school the whole day. Suddenly everyone is at home. Suddenly there's a lot of mouths to be fed, and suddenly then the realization that we actually do not have enough food, because then you'd have to prepare more meals than you would normally. Sometimes in some households they don't even make breakfast, because the school's feeding scheme would provide breakfast, and then they would provide lunch for the children. So many of them did not go and queue for the food. During the survey we would ask, do you know that there is a soup kitchen? Are you aware of a soup kitchen that is in the area? They would say yes. Do you go and queue or get food? They would say no. The reason for that was we'd found that there is a lot of stigma that is attached to being hungry. That is the norm in the communities that we live in. So imagine someone who would be working and providing and being able to buy food, suddenly finding themselves having food and having to go queue. So they have this of
struggling to access food. You know, it's worse with this war in Ukraine that we're seeing, and all of a sudden these price rises going through the roof.
I think a community nutritional hub is already a space. I mean, community kitchens currently are already a space whereby people go to receive food. There are emergency hub spots for food insecurity, for hunger, and many more interrelating social issues that are related to food insecurity and hunger.
Soup kitchens, popularly known as soup kitchens, but as Food Agency Cape Town, we started rethinking them as community kitchen based on the outcomes of the survey that we did, how they get stigmatized and how people don't feel comfortable to go in the kitchens. But if you think of a community kitchen, and our vision of a community kitchen is a space where people can go and not just get a plate of food, but can learn a skill where we try to build sustainable and resilient communities. So you come into a kitchen, you volunteer your services. You can help with dishing up, you can help with cleaning up, for instance, or washing the dishes, and then you don't feel that you are just getting a plate of food. You feel that you have contributed towards that plate of food. Ogadogo. Again, my appeal to other international organizations and local government is partner with local communities, dream together, plan together, find solutions together, and support community-led organizations. I believe that the solutions are within the communities.
We love to see young people take up space in these spaces, because young people come with a newness that is very oblivious to what the problem is, and sometimes that obliviousness feeds a lot into generating new ideas.
So yeah, the call to action would be people to be educated on food agency, on their rights to food, and to be enabled for them to practice their rights to food.
Ich hoffe, dass dieses Video noch einmal
So the video gave you a few visual impressions concerning the topic. And I'm happy to welcome our guests tonight, Dirk Meyer is head of division for global health, employment, economic transformation, digitization, and food security at the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Nice to have you here tonight, Mr. Meyer. And I'm happy to welcome Dora Marema. She will be with us on the panel tonight. She's head of municipal sustainability at the South African Local Government Association. And she's come to Berlin especially for this event, among others, and we are very happy to have her here tonight. In the past, she worked with numerous NGOs, local communities, and government institutions, dealing with topics like smallholder farming, land rights, environmental and climate issues, gender, justice, and she also founded the NGO Gender CC Southern Africa Women for Climate Justice. And during the corona pandemic, she supported women in Joburg who started urban gardens. And I guess we will hear more about this tonight. And then, of course, Ophelia Nick is here, Undersecretary of State at the BMEL. She's spoken to us already, so that'll suffice in terms of an introduction. And actually, we wanted to have Sefo Sani from Kenya here with us. She coordinates the youth working group at the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism in Rome. However, she has visa problems, and thus she has not been able to make it here. But Mr. Kampmann is here. He agreed to jump in for her. He's been in Rome often, and he is with Bread for the World, and he is a farmer himself, dealing with lots of topics, among others, agricultural policy. So thank you for being here with us tonight. Now, my first question is for Dora. And by the way, we will be on a first names basis. Dora, during the corona pandemic in Joburg, you worked with many activist women who have made concrete contributions to local food security in their communities. So can you tell us more about what you did and what the biggest challenges for low-income people are?
Thank you so much for this question. It feels weird because I have to wait for the translator to speak after you've spoken. I will learn German, I promise. So thank you for this opportunity to be able to be part of this panel. So during COVID, I think the spirit of what happened in South Africa was captured by the video that we have just seen. I had the pleasure of working with Heinrich-Böll Foundation in South Africa and many other partners. We were not prepared for what was coming at the time. We sat home. I remember in the first week, many of us started to feel very uncomfortable, knowing the precarious nature of our economy, and many of our communities were at risk. A lot of them were doing what we call piece jobs or odd jobs, and really earning every day, at the end of the day after doing the work. And we became really uncomfortable knowing that they are not going to be able to go out to do some work and to earn a living. And we wanted to actually find out how they were coping. At the time, I was just transitioning from my work with civil society into the South African Local Government Association. after working a couple of years with smallholder farmers in South Africa. And we realized that a lot of families were going hungry. A lot of families, I'm not even talking about the ones who lost their jobs because they still had a small bit of income. And immediately our first inclination was to be able to mobilize together with the smallholder farmers in the various areas to make available the food that was ready. We knew that there were traveling restrictions. The farmers were not able to go to the fields, and it was during the time of harvest in South Africa. A lot of them were losing their harvest because they couldn't access the markets, they couldn't sell to anywhere. The government later came and opened up the space for farmers to be able to start moving their produce into different spaces. But at the time, they were still locked down, and people were not able to move into supermarkets and to be able to sell their stuff in common farmers markets that were there in the community. And we started to mobilize together with the farmers who, on the other hand, were losing their produce. And on the one side, they were looking at families that were seeing what was in these smallholder farms and really asking for food. And we felt it was not the responsibility of the smallholder farmers to be able to give the food freely to the communities, even though we knew that it was difficult for them to look at their neighbors and not necessarily be able to help. So we started to facilitate conversations with them and ask them if they were willing to organize themselves into groups where they could concentrate the produce that was ready at the time. And we then on the other side negotiated with the government feeding schemes to be able to purchase from these farmers for food to be distributed not in faraway places but in the communities where they live. And I can safely say that one of the initiatives that came is a project that we ran called the Ubuntu Project, which basically means, you are because I am. And it came because farmers started to work closely together in this decentralized food, banks, if you like, that were not organized by government, but it was really self-organized by the farmers themselves together with the communities. And it was easy to move the food. They didn't need permits because they didn't have to transport the food into the neighboring communities, but it was just within their own communities. And as they were distributing the food, we realized that it was going to run out because COVID was not ending. And we decided to integrate the food relief together with the farming component. So the farmers were willing to pass on the skill to the neighbors as they were distributing the food. So we started distributing seedlings, basically a gardening starter pack with compost that was made available together with instructions on how to plant. And that started to create a closed loop where as the food that was being distributed was being consumed, the people started to grow their own food and they were able to sell back to the farmers so that there was a continuous supply of food. And as I'm talking to you today, the Ubuntu Veggie Box is now became like a small commercial community delivery box that gets, the people are delivering in schools, and they have been able to donate to make sure that all the soup kitchens that you saw, all the daycare centers, the clinics have got gardens within themselves. Thank you.
Vielen Dank für diese Eindrücke, Dora.
Thank you, Dora. This sounds encouraging, actually. Stig Tansman, my next question is for you. Now, you are following the debates of the CSIPM. You are having a close look at what is being discussed there. And you have also accompanied the current report for the United Nations, which based on the experiences of the farmers, also in the African context. So what would be the main recommendations of the CSIPM? Well, thank you for your question. Well, please bear with me. I'm sorry that Mrs. Sani can't be here, because in the video we could see that there are very good reasons why a woman from Kenya should be here. She's immediately and directly affected and concerned. But, well, okay, bear with me. I will try my best and answer your question. It has become very clear, and it goes back to what Michael Fakhri said about the war and the climate crisis. We are dealing with a food crisis. And there is a lack of food sovereignty, and most people in the world do not enjoy the right to food. Even before the pandemic, even before the war, 600 million people did not benefit from this right. So we need to face the experiences and the challenges. There are lots of people who suffer hunger, and people don't want to be seen, actually. The same goes for people in Germany, too, who suffer hunger. So Bread for the World and many other initiatives try to find an answer to the crisis, try to find solutions so that those who are affected and concerned most get an opportunity to have a say. So far, this has been prevented by many countries and groups because they benefit from the crisis. And this is what we are criticizing in Germany, too. We have had lots of demonstrations and protest marches. We would like to have healthy food and enough food for everyone in the world. And we also need a socio-political plan, because there are people who suffer hunger. There are people who don't have enough to eat. But these people also need a voice. And the CFS is certainly one of the best voices they can have. Thank you, Stieg. And what I would like to ask Mr. Meyer now in a minute, because we've heard quite a bit about the challenges in the context of the global crisis. So, Mr. Meyer, please let us know, what has the BMZ said in the last years? What have you done so far in your ministry in view of the current food crisis? And what do you do in terms of supporting vulnerable or particularly affected groups?
Ja, vielen.
Well, the mic is on. Okay, now I can hear myself. Thank you very much. Let me try and give you an insight into some specific items related to what we've said before. And I'll try to be as specific as possible. Of course, our ministry, when we're talking about hunger and food crisis, we've been working on that for years. And of course, we as the ministry also see that the war has been an accelerator. Same goes for the pandemic. But of course, there are many things that do not work well and have not worked well in general in our food systems. The previous speakers before me have shown it's not just an agricultural topic, it's a topic that relates to social policy. Mr. Tansman has just emphasized this, and we've also seen that during the film. We know we do have food, and we also know that a lot of food gets wasted between the field and the plate. We have many losses during and after harvests. And even during the current crisis, there still is a lot of food in many countries, but people don't have the money anymore to buy it. So the whole question of social support is very important. And we have focused on that as a ministry during 2022. We've learned our lesson from the COVID pandemic. We've said we need to strengthen those efforts where countries try to adjust the social systems to cushion the consequences of droughts and floods, like take the case of Pakistan. And also during the pandemic, many countries have tried to set up a system to sort of cushion the situation when people do not have access to food because of a lack of money. That, of course, is a painstaking effort, and we also need international efforts and cooperation. We currently look at the strategies of the World Bank, the International Labour Organization, and other organizations and countries who try to bundle those strategies to get some progress, to be able to develop some kind of shields, umbrellas to protect people. And another thing we do during the work of our ministries, we have once again looked at the pandemic, and related to that, right afterwards, the start of the war, we developed the global Food Alliance. We used the crisis as one way of bringing together international organizations. Of course, there were some organizations that had some difficult partners, like the FAO, which was oftentimes blocked by China, one of those members. And we've tried to, first of all, identify the most important topics to address the crisis, like, for instance, the solidarity lanes that were started by the European Union to get grain out of Ukraine during the war situation. And we also tried to find the money in order to bring together international organizations like IFAD, that takes care of smallholder farmers, or the World Food Programme. We try to support all those organizations and give support to the countries most in need. And the third aspect that we are probably going to speak about later, how about transformation of agricultural systems? Because social policy is one side of the story. On the other hand, we also have a need to overcome dependencies in agriculture. Those dependencies are partly still due to the colonial past, and we need to sort of rediscover old varieties and be able to develop a resilient crop rotation system. Here we need to bundle our efforts not only to overcome a crisis, but to develop and redevelop the production systems so that countries become more resilient to tackle crisis. These are the topics that we work on in our bilateral and also multilateral forum. Here we work very closely with organizations and partner ministries. Thank you very much. I think it's a very important aspect, the social security systems. It's not just about food and agricultural systems, it's also about the social systems. Ms. Nick, you already have talked about your strategic orientation within your ministry. Can you say something about the challenges that Dora Marima mentioned and that we've seen in the video? Does your strategy already provide some potential answers to those challenges? And what is the role of civil society groups in the local communities? How can you, as the Federal Ministry for Agriculture, strengthen those groups? Let me start with the challenges. Of course, the challenges are immense, and we indeed are talking about multiple crises occurring at the same time. And there are sometimes groups who say, well, let's just look at food security and let's focus on Germany. This is what we did last year. And of course, we oftentimes think about producing more in Germany, saying we have to feed the world. But no, this is not possible. We have so many crises. We cannot just look at one of those crises. We've got a food crisis, we've got a climate crisis, and we have a biodiversity crisis. And all of the answers we need to find need to address all those crises. It's not enough to just focus on, say, the climate crisis for a couple of years and 10 years later we would say, oh, we forgot about the rest. We need to somehow look at a broad-based discussion, and we need to integrate farmers, and we need to integrate the whole of Europe, the European Union. And since we talk about many crises, of course we had to focus on some emergency measures, short-term measures. There was the need to support Ukraine, to provide solidarity. It is a very fertile country with a very good agriculture, but all of a sudden we had to give food to Ukraine during the war. That was a short-term thing to do. And then we had to look at the grain situation and how to get it out of Ukraine and get it to the rest of the world. We've done a lot last year, and we said, well, basically this is not what we want to do. We want the countries to be self-sufficient, to develop a system, a very diverse system of their own, and this is the ultimate goal that we have. Now, that means we need to also have some mid- and long-term measures. Here, it's all about strengthening knowledge and develop capacities, focus on women's rights, on smallholder farmers. During the agricultural policy of our ministry, we also used our international work, sometimes only to sell our own agricultural produce and our agricultural machinery. Well, okay, sometimes producing or selling our own food and our own machinery is not so bad, but for the long-term future, it is all about strengthening the countries themselves, be it on a government level or be it on the level of precise projects, like, for instance, seeds and seedling productions. We need to help and support countries in overcoming dependencies. Of course, there always will be a crisis, and we have to have mechanisms to bridge and overcome crisis. And of course, food waste is one important aspect. And so we need to think about how to use the food that we produce, how to use the food and bring it to the people. It's a very important topic, and we had an agricultural conference also of the Ministry for the Environment. And of course, a lot of crops are used for energy production, fuel production. We have to find the right balance. Dorema, now over to you. You have a lot of experience working with grassroots organizations, but you also work with state institutions. From your perspective, how can state institutions, governmental institutions, multilateral institutions support the local actors, the local organizations? What do you think the German government could do in order to support the local communities like the South African communities you've mentioned?
Thank you so much. I think there were a lot of good points that have been raised, but from my perspective, having worked in civil society and now working in local government, I think one of the challenges that we face is that a lot of support that comes within the countries like my own is always at the bilateral level, meaning government to government. And that means that the support goes directly to the national government. So in a country like my own, which has got 3 levels of government, which is the national government, the provincial government, and the local government level, government, it's important to make sure that when the support comes into the country through a multilateral, a bilateral agreement, that that all the partners are actually involved. We have seen a concentration of support at a national level that does not trickle down to the local. In South Africa, the constitution states very clearly The national department is supposed to give policy direction. They set the tone in terms of what is going to be happening in the country. And then the middle, which is the provincial government's role, is to support the local government. So where the rubber hits the road, it's at the local government level. The level that is not being supported a lot is almost like an orphan, we call it, an orphan of the government. It's not integrated, it's not being supported. So for action to happen, from the voices that you heard from the video, they are talking about local government partnering with local grassroots organization. It can only happen with the support that the local government will receive from the province, but also from the national government, which normally are the custodians of the funding and the bilateral agreements that get signed with foreign governments. So what we need really is not, at the local level, there's a very clear grasp of what is the issues. People know exactly where there is a need. Because it is a space where policy meets with implementation, where the food crisis meets with climate crisis. Everything happens at the local level. What we need is dedicated budgets that will support the actions that are put forward. It's also technical support, which has been provided to a certain extent, but largely to metros. And in a country where, like my own, where you've got 256 municipalities, and you only choose to work with 8 metros, you can imagine that you are not even beginning to scratch the surface. But what we also need is political buy-in, political champions, which we are beginning to be able to see. And I think what I safely say, what we need is a direct access of funding, direct access of support that goes right into the local level. To enable municipalities to be strengthened. You spoke about building the knowledge base, building the technical expertise. But again, if we only stop at that and not actually ensure that there is funding that goes to be able to fund all of these actions to strengthen our countries, then we're not going to be able to overcome all these multiple crises that we're talking about. I believe the time is fertile right now. It's really time for us to be able to not to be shy to go to the local level. Let's partner with local municipalities, with the national government being the one that is opening the entry. So you have to say when you meet your counterpart, where is the local government in this? So meaning, they have to have a partnership with the local municipalities before you can agree onto the funding to be transferred to them. Because I must be honest, a lot of that funding support that gets given gets returned back. It's not spent, and the question is why? And you have it across all the national departments. It's purely because they are not the implementers. They do not know how to be able to translate all that they receive into tangible actions on the ground. But local government is there for that. And there are practitioners, there are dedicated experts that are willing to be able to do the work. But they just need to be able to get the funding directly going to them and not through some gatekeeper that is going to decide how and when they should be able to give this funding. Thank you.
Vielen Dank für diese sehr konkrete.
Thank you for these proposals and ideas. Mr. Meyer, I would like to come back to you. You've mentioned the Global Alliance for Food Security, launched as a G7 initiative last year with the World Bank. You said that it was launched also because of the lack of agreement within the United Nations and the institutions. Now, half a year after this initiative has been established, what has been the impact? Now, I have mentioned the solidarity lane already. This has been one of the strands of this initiative. Well, we had to bear in mind that On the one hand, the alliance wanted to be a coordination tool. Actually, it's all it wanted to be. It was meant to be a conference or so. It was meant to be a coordination tool that was to take up the leadership in a multilateral system. That's why we focused on the G7. Actually, the United Nations would have had to react, but they were blocked politically. So we had to find partners, the partners we needed in order to get something going. But then we did not want to be competitors of the task force of the United Nations. And that's what we talked about and negotiated. And then when the World Bank was on board, we addressed the African Union in Addis Ababa and asked them, would you want to join us? And they said yes. So we launched an open committee which has about 100 organizations and institutions as participants in order to talk about the priorities in the attempt to solve the crisis. And we also wanted to get access to all relevant data, also on the local level. As we've heard just a minute ago, the local level is extremely important. So we wanted to develop a tool, a joint tool or a dashboard in order to get a clear idea of what the situation currently is and what the current trends are. So we have the United Nations, multilateral organizations and the civil society and everybody involved in order to develop programs in order to make sure that the crisis does not aggravate even more. And then also when someone needs money, because the needs are very different and the different parties are affected to a different extent. So we also wanted to get access to funds in order to help overcome the crisis. Now, this is what we have done so far. If you're dealing with data, you know that this is also always about power too. I mean, the fact that so many have opened and agreed to use this tool as a management tool is good. And that's also a way to get an idea of the success of our programs. We have divided the labor. So there where the World Food Program is quite powerful, they have the leadership in order to deal with the institutions and the governments of the countries concerned in order to talk about the next steps. But then you may also have Germany and the BMZ getting involved because we do have a bilateral portfolio too, or the World Bank. So we try to focus on the countries that are affected most in order to get going. And then, of course, we also want to work on the transformation of the farming systems. This is an excellent opportunity, we think, because it allows for a coordinated approach and it helps us find out what is needed where, because we need to bear in mind that the crisis triggered by the prices, even if the prices have gone down, is still an imminent crisis, and we cannot expect this crisis to end soon. And we might even see a production crisis in the course of the year, and there might even be things that happen we do not know about today. So this is what we have been doing so far. And we do see ourselves as complementary to the UN system. Well, thank you for your explanation, Stick. If I may, let me ask you, there was a bit of criticism also with respect to the Global Alliance for Food Security. Could you give us an idea of the criticism? What has been criticized, please? And what are the answers given by the Global Food Security? Well, that's a complex question, which requires a complex answer. On the one hand, we need to say that the BMZ has really tried to reach out to our initiative, which shows that the BMZ takes the CSIPM seriously. But then we also need to see the G7 and the World Bank involvement in this initiative, which has just been described by Mr. Meyer, which is problematic for a number of people and civil societies. So the civil society has the right to co-determine, to co-decide, and that's decisive. The civil society needs to have a say. And this is why we, the Global Alliance for Food Security, has a certain criticism, is being seen by us with a certain skepticism, so to speak, because we think it's a parallel structure, a structure which has come into being in addition to what has been around in terms of structures already, but because of the right to food and because of the structures needed so that the civil society can be involved, we need to have adequate structures because we need to speak with one voice, and that's what the CSIPM does. And that's why we do see a certain criticism, because we would like to see the CFS coordinate the decisions to be taken. So if the whole thing would be transferred to the CFS, if that, which would be possible, we'd be in a much better situation to solve the problems. Because we actually need a transformation agenda. I don't see any transformation agenda. I don't see any steps towards ecological farming and other things. Mr. Meyer has said that all this needs to be done and is necessary, but we do need transformation also in order to raise funds. So we need taxation on fertilizers, for example. I mean, there are lots of problems we have seen at an early stage in the crisis already. And these are major problems. So we need to really discuss the transformation of the food system. And actually, these discussions have been held by the CFS since 2019 already. We also talked about recommendations and processes. The UN Food Systems Summit and others, well, they tend to be forgotten. All these initiatives tend to be forgotten or are being seen in a negative light with the CFS because of the negotiations which have taken place there. But the civil society has made it clear we want redistribution. We need redistribution. It's often frustrating to negotiate. It's also frustrating for the civil society, but we need to negotiate because we need to know where are the blockades in the transformation process. Also with the CFS 50, we have seen that some G7 countries, not Germany, not European ones, but others, often when answers are needed in view of the crisis, don't agree to give these answers. So we need to make sure that there are no parallel structures. We need to dissolve these parallel structures. And we hope that we can also use Michael Fakhri's organization and others in order to solve this problem and in order to combine what needs to be combined, especially since the CFS has its civil society mechanism, which has been developed by Brazil under the PT government, which is the direction into which you would want to go too, Mr. Meyer. Because we need to shape on the local level what Dora has described. So you don't want to have the local authority on board only. You need to have the local civil society on board in order to hold the governments accountable so that the money gets where the money is needed.
Für die sehr klaren Worte. Uns rennt die Zeit davon. Ich möchte gleich.
Well, I would like to give the audience an opportunity to take the floor, but Mr. Meyer, you have an opportunity to answer in one sentence to what we have just heard with respect to the transformation towards agroecology. Well, actually, this has been part of our debates since day one, and everybody has talked about it. And even major players like the World Bank are launching their own programs in order to have a repurposing of the agenda, i.e. the World Bank too has or sees a focus on the organizational needs on the state level. So by talking and by working on the organization, you bring change and transformation about. And this is what we are seeing right now. And we will also have representatives of the World Bank here these days, and we will talk about these aspects. And we don't want to have the GAFs as a permanent structure, by the way. It's a mechanism we use in order to be able to do something in the crisis and in order to have the fast response, in order to act quickly. So I do see the Global Alliance as a temporary organization which eventually will return to other organizations or structures. So it's not that problematic, I'd say. One more question to Mrs. Nick before the audience get the floor. The ministries cooperate as well. Mrs. Nick, what about your particular ministry in view of the Global Alliance? How do you collaborate?
Well, all those big questions, all the bodies we have, the UN Food Systems Summit and joint conferences, all these organizations we're in close contact with. And we also send communiques and we also work with them. But when we work with individual countries, we also work together with the bilateral partners. We, as the Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture, we are very close to the concrete projects on the ground. So we take, for instance, care of animal health, and we take care of foot and mouth disease and whatever. So we know exactly what the farmers are busy with on the ground. These are the topics we deal with in much detail. And of course, there are other institutions like the Foreign Office or the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation. We talk to what their concerns are when it comes to seeds and seedlings. We also try to work together with the other ministries. But let me come back to the earlier discussion. Let me come back to what Dora said, the different levels of government and how to address and how to work with them. I mean, here, all of us in our German ministries, We also want to strengthen our regional, local agriculture, and it's so difficult. We need to work day by day. It's always difficult. Of course, it's always easier to have a big farm, to have a huge monoculture, and if we want to diversify and if we want to, for instance, improve the regional varieties, it costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of effort. And we know we need to spend money, and we know we have to have stamina. And the same goes for the other countries. And I have talked to many international partners. And sometimes when I talk to a government and they want to have a quick success, and they say, we need a lot of cows and pigs, you've got good animals, bring them. And if we tell them, why don't you use your own livestock? Why don't you use your own varieties? It's also individual. It needs to develop individually. It's so difficult to make people understand. You always have to say right from the start, your regional agriculture is important. And then you drill down and you go down to the individual project level and look at what works best, what's best for them. Is it better to have sheep or goats there or whatever? How can you create local storage spaces for crop production and so on and so forth? This is what all governments must take much more seriously. There is the Africa strategy. It's called the 2063 strategy. There, the African countries had made a commitment to spend much more money on the development of really regional agriculture. And we need to always emphasize that is so important. It's one of the main tasks for each and every government. They must put the money into this regional aspect, into the development of a stable, resilient regional agriculture. Then we can have fair supply chains and fair trade. And of course, this is something that we are very much focused on here. We work with all our partners and other ministries in order to improve the fair trade situation. Let's take palm oil, cocoa, and how to make our supply chains greener, how to avoid dangerous things here. We need to focus much more and use the right and develop the right instruments and use them later on. I can see many people here on the panel support the aspect of making agriculture something regional. Let me give the floor to some of our people in the audience. We have 2 persons here with microphones, so make sure you use a microphone. I'm a historian and I'm a member of the Green Party coming from the center of Berlin. I'd like to go one step back, look at the times of apartheid and colonial rule. All the land was in the hand of the whites. Large farms, monoculture. As a result, many problems, many crises developed. And the current COVID crisis and the war have exacerbated pre-existing crisis. What was done now that apartheid is over to strengthen smallholder farms? And what was done in order to promote organic farming? What was done to develop gender justice? What was done in order to reduce massive unemployment? And what was done in order to create food security? Of course, it is a structural problem, a problem linked to transformations. And there's so many things that need to be done in order to overcome hunger. My thesis, my assumption would be that we still are confronted with the consequences of colonialism and apartheid. And I think there's still a lot to be done by all of us. Stig Tansman has said something very good about the need to work together in that respect. Dora, let me hand over to you. It was a statement and a question directed at you.
No, thank you so much. Thank you for the question. I think you began to respond to your own question towards the end, when you said that we basically it's all about structural issues. And when you think about how long apartheid was with us, it's not something that you can be able to solve in a day. I know that the current government is quite a while since they are in power. However, it has been really near impossible to be able to undo all the damage that was done. And I think it's not only in terms of rebuilding infrastructure and transferring the land, it's also about mindsets. There is still the challenge of the land, which is still in the majority of the privileged and the white people, and the small percentage of the land that has been transferred in the hands of the previous owner or the so-called previously disadvantaged has not come with the means. So land on its own is not something that is going to transform people's lives. We know that is important, but if people have to derive economic value out of that land, they need a lot more than just the land itself. They also need more than just the money to go with the land. It's also about the skills. It's about access to technology, access to all sorts of means of production. But also, it's also a mindset, right? A lot of our people have been socialized in a certain way in which they're made to believe that they're supposed to be working for someone. And to eventually just wake up one morning with access to this commodity, which we believe it can be transformational. However, you still have a mindset of a slave, or a mindset of someone who thinks like a laborer is not going to do much to you. And I think we have seen government introduce a lot of grants that have not been transformational at all. We've got a really huge grant system in South Africa where people have got access to free education, free housing, free electricity, free water. Those who are disadvantaged and are not able to look after themselves or are not able to work or even earn a decent living. However, what we are asking for is contributions that are going to transform, and not just to perpetuate a culture of people continuing to become dependent. We're talking about the dependency, to be dependent. It's literally transferring a whole, transferring the land together with the knowledge and the information and everything that will transform the lives. And we've got an opportunity to do it with the young people right now. Because we can say the old people is very difficult to be able to change them. But we've got an opportunity with the young people. However, as you know, right now, we are facing a very, very difficult situation there's an energy crisis. Besides all the crises that you are facing, we've got a serious energy crisis, which has been there nearly for 15 years, if not 16 years. And it almost makes it difficult to even start talking about just transition. Because a lot of our people still don't have access to basic services. So to be able to introduce something on top of that, it becomes very, very difficult. So we are looking for transformational actions, actions that cannot be solved by the format of negotiations and programs that design the problem in the first place. We need a leadership that can be transformational, that can reimagine and divorce itself from the status quo or the business as usual, and literally think like they've got a clean slate. They have to think in a radical way that is not tied to the past, because I think we are so afraid of changing things. We are so afraid of changing the formats in which we are supposed to help us move forward. It has to be, when I think of it, the climate crisis, the energy crisis, the food crisis, all of these things, we continue to be caught up in a web, just like in South Africa, because we are not able to think beyond the past and completely divorce and close our eyes, because what stops us to think different from what the previous governments and leaders have done in the past? Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Dora. So, ich hatte eine Person.
There was one more person who wanted to take the floor. I had promised the person to give the mic. Good evening. Can you hear me? First of all, I'd like to thank you for the interesting contributions, statements. I absolutely agree to the last statement we just heard. I think what stops us sometimes also is sometimes that decision makers are focused on profits. But that's not what I wanted to say. I wanted to say something different. I wanted to not ask a question, but give a statement regarding the statement given by Ophelia Nick. Ms. Nick, did I understand you correctly? Because at the end of the day, it was a kind of framing to say, well, the nations in the global south should be more committed, should support their smallholder farmers. Let me quote you. You said verbally, we need to feed the world. What kind of a frame is that? I mean, when we look back 10 years before, we exported our food at rock-bottom prices, and we destroyed global systems, regional systems. And we also should talk about that aspect as well, because we have neo-colonialism in the title of our event. So how come we do not manage a transformation as regards our own way of working? Are there groups with powerful interests? Tyler, there's one more person, but we have a time problem, so make it a short question. And then we'll have a final round of statements, and I think our panelists will be here for a bilateral discussion after our panel discussion.
I'm coming from the United States. My organization is called Family Farm Defenders, and we're a member of the international peasant movement La Via Campesina. I think my question is very similar, so maybe both ministries could address it. You noted the need for coherence between short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures to address the overlapping crises that the world is facing right now. For Via Campesina, the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants is a key solution that we are pushing for right now in the UN Human Rights Council. And we believe that if peasants' rights are recognized, particularly the right to land, the right to food, and the right to food sovereignty, then we can really end the crisis of hunger. So my question is, what is the position of both ministries of the German government on the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants? Thank you.
Dankeschön. Also UN-Kleinbauernerklärung. Wie sieht es da mit der Umsetzung aus?
Ja, dem kann ich...
Well, I absolutely agree to you, and I can speak on behalf of my ministry, so it's not just my personal opinion that I'm going to utter here. I am also a member of the working group of small-scale farmers, small-holder farmers. We are also members of Via Campesina. Thanks for mentioning that declaration. During discussions, and whenever I talk to my international colleagues, we are talking about the agricultural lobbies. We have a very strong agricultural lobby of the big corporations. And when you went on a demonstration in summer, they said, if we support the small farmers and we do not allow here plant fertilizers and pesticides, we need to have this large-scale agriculture in Germany because we need to feed the world. And this is, of course, the wrong position. I am not defending that position. That is why I was saying we have a hunger crisis. We have famine. We need to, of course, help the people who are in acute situations, and we need to use the Grain and World Food Programme and all of that. But of course, when we talk about the transformation of our nutrition, of our food production systems, we need more resilience, we need climate protection, we need soil improvement measures, all the wonderful things that can be done. And It's not just about one-sided quantities and increasing productivities in our countries here in the north. This is not going to feed the world. But of course, the agricultural lobby, the big agribusinesses, they want to monopolize everything. Now imagine, sometimes there are 100 farmers I have a conversation with, and of course they're angry, and they really say, well, we need more freedom to produce the way we want. We need to sell our products to the world. Of course, we want free trade, but what we need to also look at is the resilient smallholder farms. That is sustainable, and here our mid and long-term goals need to have this in mind. But fighting the agribusiness and fighting those different opinions is very difficult, and we have to stand together in order to improve the situation. That is why I did not support the position of the big ones, but rather made a satirical statement. I have a very brief question to all of you for our final rounds, so we don't speak for too long. Mr. Meyer. Michael Fakhri, in the beginning, emphasized that we need to work together to improve international cooperation and secure the right to food. At the end of this term of office, when would you say your ministry did a good job? And maybe you can also say, how about the UN Declaration on the Right of Farmers? Is that important for you? I think our ministry will have done a good job at the end of this term of office if we have really been able to cushion in a meaningful way the consequences of the COVID pandemic and the war. And we will have done a good job if we succeed in really getting transformation done. Based on scientific knowledge, we know that the goal of overcoming hunger will require lots of efforts, but still we'll be able to manage that if we do it actively within 10 or 15 years. Smallholders, small-scale farmers are at the center of everything. We focus on those farmers for the purpose of the transformation we'd like to push and roll out. Coming back to what Dora said, it's also about economic ecosystems. So we need an agriculture, a local agriculture that is modern. They must have access to great technologies, advice systems. So for young people, it must be interesting to become a farmer and feed the family that way. We also need organic development of organic farming here at the end of the term of office. We also would like to be in a position to say, yes, we have more organic farming now. And of course, it's all about changing our own lifestyles here in Yarmouth. So meat production and deforestation because of crops being used for fuel production here. By the end of the term of office, we must be able to say we made some progress, we changed our own lifestyle, and that will make us less colonial. Dora, how about you? What would be the last statements from your side you'd like to communicate to our representatives of the German ministries? What do you think should change during the next 2 or 3 years? What should the German government do? And I also would like to ask you about the gender aspect. You have a lot of gender expertise, and gender justice is one of your major topics. How should gender fair systems look like? I know it's a huge topic, but maybe you can put it in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. For me, one of the best things to do would be to focus on on building local, decentralized local food systems, because we have tried them and we know that they will be they are very resilient during the times of crisis. People do not, cannot be waiting on food to be, to arrive from faraway places in aeroplanes and in trucks, but they can be able to make sure that in their own local areas, they are able to ensure that there is food. And I think majority of the people who are very active in the local, food production systems, at least in Southern Africa, are actually women. They are the ones that are really the center of this. And if you want to be able to make sure that you are supporting something that is going to be very gender responsive, is to be able to look at building decentralized local food systems. In that way, you are supporting the work of women. They do not have to travel very far, and really strengthen that. And I think rather than having a top-down approach, have a bottom-up, working together with the local authorities who have to create an enabling environment. And really they know what is going on, and they're very close to the situation, to their communities, and they know what kind of food. And I think the one important thing is the access to agricultural inputs. In this case, we are talking about agroecology. We are talking about organic agriculture, not giving them GMO seed like what we have seen in my own country, which is something that is not really helpful. It's not building on the biodiversity. It's not strengthening the crop production in the face of droughts and floods. It's really giving ownership in terms of the whole value chain. It's not about production alone. It's about also logistics. It's about agro-processing, the whole value chain, making sure that women play a very critical role at a local level, and they inform what then goes into the various food security strategies and policies within their own countries. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Wir halten fest, wir müssen unbedingt die.
Thank you very much. We understand we need to address the local women, and that will help us to make a major progress. Ms. Nick, the same question to you that I gave to Mr. Meyer. When would you say you did a good job when it comes to implementing the right to food?
Now we have talked quite a bit about the problems today, and it certainly makes sense to have a closer look at what happens. But then we also need to see where things are working quite well. I mean, we've talked about Zimbabwe and other places, but then, and the fact that the whole country is turning into a desert. But then there are also cases in which, in spite of the fact that it hasn't rained for 3 years, farming is possible. So it's always important to get access to the land, to capital, and to knowledge, and that's key. And if we could show much more and much better that small-scale farming is the most sustainable option, and that the highly productive farming, industrialized farming, is not for the benefit of the planet. So if we managed to show this, I'd be happy. I mean, you talk about food stability at a G20 meeting, but then during the lunch break, you have 3 different types of meat on your plate. So whether it's via the bodies, the institutions, the organizations, you might truly have a focus on the regional, the small-scale approach. It might be good. It would be good. It would taste good to have these products on your dish as well. So if we manage to do this in the next 3 years, we don't have much time left, I'd be happy. Sounds good. Thank you. Stieg, what would you like to recommend to the two representatives of the government we are having here tonight? Well, be brave, more courage, act. You need to act because we need action. You do have the machine, right? You are representing the ministries. You have what is needed in order to do something. You have the means to prove and to show that we need the transformation, and that's your task, that's your duty. Which means you also need to talk about distribution. We haven't talked about distribution tonight. We haven't talked about the colonial system either. Whereas the civil society has asked for changes for years. What more can we do? There are certain limits, and we cannot go beyond. We, the civil society, we in our organization. Others, however, go beyond those borders, those boundaries. But we need to talk about distribution. Possession of land, that's an unjust system, not only in Africa, but also in Latin America, where you have the old structures of land, property, and you have new structures of the same old type here in Berlin, in Brandenburg, too. So we need to talk about these structures. We do have lots of partners, good partners, but many of them benefit also with their agro-business like the United States or Canada, who are only looking at their own export interests. So we need new alliances in order to work on the basis of the human rights. Right to food means we all have to have the same right to healthy food and to sustainable food each and every day without being beggars and in a self-determined way. And this is what we need to do. So we hope that you will benefit from the next 3 years in order to do this, and that the different special rapporteurs are much more included in the German policy.
Ganz vielen Dank, Stig. Ich glaube.
Well, thank you, Stig. Right, you are. We need courage, and we need to overcome the power structures, and we need to go new ways. This is the end of today's event. However, this is the beginning of the Alternative Green Week, and there are lots of interesting and exciting events we would like to present you with. But I would like to also thank our panelists very much. And I would like to thank TMG and Board für die Welt, our cooperation partners. And I would like to thank the technicians, the technical team, and the interpreters who have worked for you tonight. And let me tell you what will happen this week, furthermore. There will be an exciting specialized day, an experts day about healthy food and the future food system. Tomorrow night, there will be an exciting panel discussion about fertilizers and how to overcome fossil energy, which also means that we have to overcome nitrogen fertilizers. This is a panel discussion in cooperation with Ciel and Inkota. On Thursday, we will talk about the transformation of nutrition in times of inflation and how that works. which is another event organized with the Climate Alliance in Berlin. And on Friday, there will be 2 more exciting discussions about the contribution of Europe and also a discussion about genetic engineering. ABL and VUND will be the hosts, and at the end of this week, we will have Soup and Talk here at the foundation. And we are looking forward to this event in particular because for the first time after 2 years, this is going to be a presence event, as it's called. And I hope to see you again. Thank you and bye-bye.